Hi, this is Ralph Woodall. This is working with the virtual harvest question and answer session. So we wanted to basically take another week to go over some of the past and answer questions that might be coming up. And for this particular session, I haven't had too many particular questions coming in, but don't hesitate to write those in if you have any particular questions or follow-ups, and we can get those either answered in the next session, or I can forward those actually on to other departments that would be able to give more detail for you. Also, on this particular one, I'm going to be dealing more with some more of the historical early days of my traveling and road sales and so forth, and lots of different parts and pieces thereof. So wanted you to kind of bear with me, but also to think in terms of sharing that and trying to get a little bit of fun perspective out into the world for you. Now, as a follow-up to last session, I was talking about not being able to find the original data booklets, for the old hop specifications. And basically, luckily, as luck would have it, I was able to go through some archives and track that down. And so what we're dealing with here, again, would be the first varietal data booklet, and doesn't have a physical date on it, but I imagine it would probably be late 80s, early 90s. And this particular one, 13 hops. Okay, that's what we're listed here. So you can see what that relates to. And, you basically have your cascades, and the list goes Nugget, Galena, Chinook, Cluster, Tatnang, Hollow, Mount Hood, Fogle, Willamette, Cascade, Liberty, Centennials, and Pearls. So that would be about 90 is what we're dealing with in that zone. And then probably about 91, we did a kind of the same amount of hops, but we added into it basically the interpretive guide into it. So we started getting a little more details in there. And that interpretive guide has gone on from there, but it gives you, alphabets, HSIs, and so forth. But just let you know that we were getting that information in oils and profiles starting at that basic time. And again, it goes back into the same varieties. So that was kind of fun to be able to track that back. So you can see it's even thinner now from what the other ones were that we were using before. And then also just another fun one we had was for the English hops. And of course, they had a little more details on English hop varieties. This is English hop products. And that basically was part of the EHP. That was Hop Union over in Europe, and getting together with the English hop products. So that variety booklet has, lots more details inside, lots larger, a little bit more follow-up as far as the growing hops and so forth. Just a lot more detail as far as that goes. But then there's also another guide for growing hops, basically into the National Hop Association of England had a booklet as well. So these are some of the early days, having basically breakdowns of the hop varieties and so forth. So it gives you a sense there of some of the different things we were using in order to be able to get the hop world, the brew world, advice about hop varieties and so forth. So we had that going on and get that taken care of. And then basically going into some of the funness of the past, I wanted to go over a couple of just kind of a fun storyline here. This goes back into an old kind of a detail of Ralph Woodall. And at that time, it's kind of a little writing, fun little thing that would be used in, let's say, a magazine or something, an article about my nature, and kind of fun one. So it's got, I'll read it here for you and appreciate your keeping the faith up with me today, because it's been one of those weeks. Ralph Woodall, Director of Craft Brew and Sales, got my phone number. I'm Ralph 2, not Ralph 2. So that's Ralph T-O-O and not T-W-O, because we had Ralph Olson and Ralph Woodall. And so then it says, rock on, or was that hop on? Okay, you got to do what you got to do because you got to do what you got to do. And sometimes you have to go along to get along. Is it beer 30 yet? Okay. And then so Ralph is a born and bred Yakamaniac with hops in his blood. He worked on the hop harvest during the high school and college years. After graduating from Western Washington University with a BA in 75, worked 4 years in human services and a year with trucking PIE motor freight before finding his place at Hop Union in August of 83, known then as Western Hop Company. He made the rounds in the office over the past 25 years. So this is a long time ago at this point now. but has always helped out with craft brewing sales. He's been traffic manager from 83 to 86, production manager from 87 to 94, director of operations from 95 to 97 before taking the position of director of craft brewing sales, which he's held since June of 97. So remember, that goes all the way up to about 14 zone. And so he travels all over the U.S. and Canada making sales calls and participating in conferences, lectures, and brew festivals. He's extremely creative, goal-oriented, and good-humored. In his spare time, he collects Western art, dabbles in photography, travels, and works on his rock gardens. And so that's kind of the fun. And it says, how would those who know Ralph Woodall describe him? Good-humored. That's a joke, son. Goal-oriented. Keep it going. Extremely creative. A mind is a terrible thing to waste. Somewhat religious. Always saying, God save our souls. So that gives you kind of a sense of my nature there. And you get that going back into, just traveling and back and forth and around. And so part of what I was wanting to do today was kind of go over a little bit with you some of the traveling days that I had, going back into basically being the road warrior back in those days, and sales calls and so forth. And I picked out a particular year to work with you guys and give you some insight into it. And it turns out that we're talking about the year 2003. And at that time was one of my busier years, making road calls and trips all over the United States. And I drew a map of that, and basically on this map, basically showing you kind of the roundups of where I was flying to, different events happening all over the States, and going on just back and forth, up and down and around and this and that. And at the bottom of it, it basically says that Ralph Woodall, Hopkins, CBS LLC, 2003 road trips over through 300 breweries visited at that moment in time. And so that was where I decided to create basically a nice little poster, or more of a collage. And the collage basically was dealing with, showing that. And then from there, it's a little bit, it's going to be tough to see, but at the same time, it basically shows the collection of all of the different beer glasses and different events and trips that I would be going on during the course of the year. And it's got my business card there. And so in those years, I was collecting so much. Every place I would go to, I'd be stopping off and getting the beer from them. And at the end of the road trip or coming back to the house, I would set those up on my kitchen cabinet above the sink. And so that's where you'd see this as an example, the amount of glasses and beers and so forth that would be from a particular year. And so then at the end of the year, I would scoop all those off and put them into a big container and snap the top on it, start a fresh new year. And so on this particular poster here, it basically has the beer collection from 2001, 2002, and 2003. And this represents 2003, and this one here is the 2000, and down below is 2004. But wanted to read a fun little part of this story to give you some insights into it. And this is a storyline. Let me get back here a little bit. Kind of a fun one to share with you, and it's called the Woodall Has Grand Slam of Beer Fest. And it's by Cindy Pitts, Hopkins, and CBS. Well, I actually put it together and said, hey, let's have you sign off on it so it doesn't look like I'm trying to promote myself. But, so Ralph Woodall recently completed what he likes to call the Grand Slam of summer beer festivals. Something akin to the PGA Tour, Ralph traveled back and forth across the country to accomplish this feat. The tour started June 3rd with a sales trip through Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and Oregon to attend the June 7th Mountain Brewers Beer Festival in Idaho Falls. He then attended the Washington Brewers Guild Summerfest in Seattle on June 14th and 15th. He then traveled to Maine for a 2-week vacation back to my mom's childhood home there. And then he traveled into Maine for 2 weeks and then followed around there at making sales calls in Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, and Vermont. He attended the Vermont Brew Festival in Burlington on July 18th and 19th. Ralph returned to Yakima for 2 days and then attended the Oregon Brewers Festival in Portland on the 25th and 27th of July. After another 3 days home, he flew to Minneapolis and made sales calls in Minnesota and Wisconsin before attending the Great Taste of the Midwest Festival in Madison on August 9th. During this period of 2.5 months, Ralph visited over 115 breweries and brew pubs. He has visited over 200 breweries and brew pubs so far in 2003. The tour includes a Celebrator 15th anniversary party and Barley Wine Fest in San Francisco, Rocky Mountain Microbrewery Symposium in Colorado Springs, the National Craft Brewers Convention in New Orleans. Basically, his 2003 tour series will finish with much attendance. He's going to be going to the Organic Brew Festival on September 13th in Gresham, Oregon, the Great American Beer Fest in Denver on September 25th through the 27th, the National Master Brewers Association Convention in Milwaukee on October 4th through the 7th, the Northwest Master Brewers Association in Seattle on October 18th, and finally the Washington Brewers Guild Cask Festival in September on October 25th. There may be more in store. So you can see this tripping back and forth and around in flights and so forth was quite a summer for me. And that was basically part of my world back in those days. And each one of these trips would be planned out in advance and showing locations and people and contacting with the brewers, making those sales calls, knocking on the doors and being right there in front of everybody. And then also during those events, we would basically bring in basically our hop display, and we'd have the booth set up, and we would have different hop varieties and give exposure to the people that were there to smell and rub those hops. And a lot of these summer events was really fun because it really gave us a hands-on feeling for the breweries and also for the participants that were there. So we were able to attend those events and really make good inroads into a lot of the national craft brewers, burgeoning market at that time. And I also basically used to say at the time, I'd be driving down through a neighborhood or into a city, coming through a back area, and they could also smell, wait a minute, that smells like beer being brewed in there, and you'd be the first one knocking on the door going in. So that's kind of what we were on the front side. And then it finishes up here. It says, Busy Bachelor. In case you're wondering if Ralph has a wife, he doesn't. As a bachelor, he's able to set his own hours, come and go as he pleases, excuse me. And he hasn't counted out getting married, but would need to find a woman in the airline industry so he could spend quality time during his frequent layovers. He likes to say he checks into his house and puts everything away and is glad to see familiar surroundings, even family pictures on the walls. It's a tough job, but like he says, someone has to do it. So that's kind of a good, and that's basically a fun little one again to be able to just give you some insight, share a little bit more of that world. And one of the things I wanted to share with you too, I had basically calendars, and I collect calendars each year. These go back to 2000. So these are individual calendars, and it's showing my events and things that I did during those periods of time. And so that's going a lot of years now. But anyway, I had the one particularly that I was working on was the calendar for 2003. And that's where this particular Grand Slam of Brewfest events was going on. And basically would go through the different events, showing whether it's vacation day, work day, where I was going to. And actually back in those days, I was recording my beer consumption, things that were happening, back in August. And then during September, of course, we had all of the hop selection going on back and forth and going into the Great American Beer Festival and going from that point. And so from there, we ended up November, you'd be finishing up. And then finally, when you got into December, you were home safe and you didn't have anything going on. This is all work oriented, but then you had your holidays and so forth. But that was the case of trying to make sure, that we were following up and recording where you're at. Also during that time, with kind of the fun part about it, I had the little notebook that'd be taken along. You'd write notes when you're visiting locations. And basically this one here, example would be going in for 5-season hop party roots, and then beer cards going in, different people. Then you'd have Gulf Island, Canada, going through clearing customs, and then just different places that you'd be going into. You'd be writing notes about it. And Eric from Main Street, samples of the crop did not, was the same domestic different varieties, wanted to see what some of the characteristics were like. So he wanted to have some samples sent out. And then basically just going on, sending out T-shirts to this person. This wanted somebody, Smoky Mountains, he wanted a T-shirt and a hat, and some Cascades, and then keychains and different things like that. So part of it was marketing as well, going out and doing things. And I had made a little note here at one point. This is kind of an interesting one too. This is all over the United States, back and forth and around. And on that particular one, I kind of wrote up a note here that says, during the years 97 through 2007, which is about 10 years, made over 2,000 stops. Basically, it would be, basically on what it'd be looking at would be, Washington State, going around the Great Basin tours and New England tours and Great Taste of Midwest tours and the Oregon Brew Festival tours, the British Columbia, Canadians, Victoria and Vancouver areas, Montana, Idaho Falls, and Nashville and Cleveland, and going to Chicago and Atlanta and down into the Boone Fest in California, and going all the way around the whole United States. And each of these regions, you would be going into just every which way but loose. So that's kind of that loop around and showing you kind of my perspective on, well, these are my different regions and areas that I was going to in the United States, and adding those particular ones into, of course, then we'd have your road atlas. This one's from 2001. So you'd have your pre-trips set up and you'd know what you're doing, and going into a particular location, you'd be also having access to the, I had a couple of fun ones here too. I couldn't find my 2003 recap sheet, but I've always had basically a listing of the different locations in the breweries off of our address collection, and had them by state. So when I was going into a particular state, I would know, where I was going to be stopping and seeing and visiting. And I'd have a listing in there of who the brewers were, their address and so forth, general communications regarding, where they would be. This particular one here would be out of working through Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and through here. And so that's a case of stopping in, Wachusett Brewing Company, Watch City Brewing Company, Crosby's and Bakers was there, Buzzards Bay, dealing here with Salem Beer Works, going into John Harvard's Brew House out in Boston, and Rock Bottoms was in Boston at that time, and another John Harvard's, and basically going into Slesser Brothers Brewing Company, the Brew Moon restaurant in Boston, and then dealing there with basically Concord Breweries, and going into basically Cambridge Brewing Company, Harpoon Brewery, working its way through there, going into Larry's Fine Ales and Lowell Brewing Company, and going into John Harvard's, it was a downtown Mercury, and then Owen O'Leary's, and going into Coddington Brewing Company and Trinity Brew House, Union Station. And so that's where, out to Cambridge for, John Harvard's and the Rock Bottoms, and going into just all over the place. And so what that related to was following up with those, making notes on there, talking that who the person was, being able to then find out if they had any insight on hop needs going forward and so forth. So we had that to be able to go in to, had my itineraries from those trips and find locations where you'd get your rental cars at, and you'd kind of map that out to where you were getting yourself sorted into a sense of not just willy-nilly running. You had it organized and pre-set up as far as the dates and communications ahead of time. And that's the things where we'd be dealing with, example, with you dealing with just different things happening that you'd have to keep up with. And so then from there, I always had to have, you'd be getting your local maps. So you'd have an opportunity to be looking here at Boston and getting around through, and you'd know whereabouts you were going. And ideally, kind of sit down in the evening and pencil out where your next runs were going to be after you'd already preset that up with them. On that particular note, I would also go through example for 2002, where we had the Master Brewers New England Tour and BAA. That was back in September. And again, that goes back into that same situation. This would be a year earlier, but you've got the, Crosby and Baker, the Buzzards Bay, Coddington Brewing Company, Brewers Wholesale, Trinity, Union Station, Salem Beer Works, Mercury Brewing, Cambridge, Boston Beer Works, John Harvard, Rock Bottom, and so forth, Watch Cities, Concord, Ono, Leary's, John Harvard, and so forth. Some of the same locations, but we're taking advantage of each of these conventions, National Brew Fest and so forth like that, or the craft brewers conventions, making sales calls in the area during that particular event. So you'd fly in, make those sales calls around that area, and then go to the the main event, and be there and able to meet up with everybody at that one moment in time. So those are basically some of the functions that we would be doing in order to keep our sales exposure going on. And then I'd get back again, would go over all of those notes and be able to, follow up with those individuals. Also, or maybe they're closed, knock them down, they're no longer available in business. It could be that there's a new person involved, so you get a new contact there. There could be brand new breweries, be the first one on the radar for them. So, I'd gone through basically on that 2003, again, just kind of a little bit more insight. Back in January, basically, it was, just going into Seattle for Washington Brewer Guild meetings and so forth. And then in February, going over to Olympia for the Washington Brewers Guild. And then basically down into, and that was that trip down to Sacramento and going to the Toronado Barley Wine Festival Celebrators 15th anniversaries, and then making trips around San Francisco, going up to Chico to see the Sierra Nevada brewery guys there and having dinner with them. And then going back down to Sacramento and then flying over to Denver, and then from Denver going over to Golden, doing the Coors, and then drive down to Colorado Springs, like I said, for that Rocky Mountain Micro Symposium, and then driving back up to Denver, flying back home. Then in March, basically going again to more Seattle, Washington Brewer Guild meetings, and then going to the Spring Fest over in Seattle. So these are events that were taking place even before my Summer Fest Grand Slam. So I was over there on the 29th for the Spring Beer Fest in Seattle and coming back. And then that's when we did the national event going down in April to Nashville, Tennessee, and going down to see Bosco's and around through Kentucky and Knoxville, Tennessee, and over to Asheville and down to Greenville and dropping in Atlanta, seeing the Sweetwater guys there. And then back up to Nashville and going around to Clarksville and so forth. And that's also when they had the home brew day at Bosco. So I'd be there to help and to visit, talk to people in the home brew world. And then on the 4th of May, that's when they had a tornado in Nashville. So all of a sudden it was like, whoa, wait a minute, what's going on here? So they had delayed some flights. So I was basically flying from Nashville down to the CBC in New Orleans. And so now we're down in New Orleans, and of course you got the heat going on there and the nightlife and the back and forth and around. And so that was basically the 10th of May was the big banquet going on. And then we're looking at the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th. So a big national craft brewers convention in New Orleans at that time. We'd have our booth set up and have all of our sales team, and then also ambassadors would come into town, and some of our grower owners would be there as well. So we were all just having the exposure going on for our hop world. And then from there, got back in, then I would drive back over. After that was be done on the 13th of May, driving back into another Seattle Washington Brewers Guild meeting, coming back home. And then that's when I started those summer trips, going up June, going up into Spokane, Coeur d'Alene, Whitefish, Missoula, down to Big Sky Fest. And then over there, dropping over through Helena, Bozeman, and Ashland, Idaho, down into Victor, Idaho, to Jackson Hole, and down into the Idaho Falls, and then getting that Idaho Falls, Mountain Brewery Brew Fest. And that's where, from there, you're leaving back now, driving back in through Boise, Idaho, making calls in Boise, and then going in through all the way back up through the Tri-Cities and Prosser, Sunnyside, and home. And then turn right around, you got the Seattle Summerfest coming up on the 14th. So you're over there for the Summerfest, and then you're getting out of there. And on the 27th, you're flying to Portland, Maine of June. And you had the vacation there with the parents for a couple of weeks. Next thing you know, you're driving back in through Portland, making sales calls. You're driving across in through basically, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, over to Springfield and Albany, New York, and Saratoga, Glen Falls, Lake George, making calls along the way, going up to Burlington, Vermont. And next thing you know, you've got the 17th is the sales calls in Burlington. The 18th, you're at the Magic Hats and the Otter Creeks. And then on the 19th is the Brew Festival starts. So the 20th, you got to drive back down to Portland so you can fly home, and then from there, next thing you know, you get July 27th, you've been home for, like I said, in there 3 days. And next thing you know, you're at the Oregon Brewers Guild, the barbecue for the Oregon Brew Fest. The 25th is the Oregon Food Fest. 26th, you got the booth there, like we were talking about, organic, basically the Oregon Brew Fest driving home, so that's where a case where you turn right around on the 27th, and then on the 31st of July, you're flying to Minneapolis, and you go, wait a minute, now what's going on here? So I was back there to visit my niece, 12-hour flight to get there. But then on the 4th, you're out visiting August Shell. The 5th, you're over in Appleton and Green Bay and going to Breeze Malt. The 6th, you're basically over in Milwaukee, Delafield, Madison. The 7th in Madison Falls, you're at New Glarus Brewing Company. And then you go into Madison for the Capital City Party. And then on the 9th is the Great Taste of the Midwest in Madison. So you're right there across from the state capitol. You're on the waterfront there in the park. And that's a really fun time. And that's where you, again, have the hop booth set up and you're showing the hops and busy, and all the people are coming back and forth. You're able to go to each individual spot, talking with the brewers, having a beer, toasting and seeing how they're doing, and following up and showing your commitment to them. And so I was the only guy for the company in that time. So that's where the Road Warrior came into play. And so then from there, next thing you know, you're driving back to Minneapolis and flying home, get back into the 23rd of July and, of August. And that's when we had the homebrewers group here called Yakimania. And that's where we had a group of the Northwest homebrewers would come to Yakima every year for big rally party called Yakimania. And on that time, we had all of the different homebrew beers and so forth and tours that were going on for them. And so that was where it was set up. And then now you're into September. And so that's the 6th of September. And that's my 51st birthday. So you can just go, what's going on? And then you turn right around in Portland. You're back to the Portland for the Organic Brew Festival, had the SBC tours at that point ahead of time. And then the 14th, you're back home. And then you're dealing with the hop selection going on. So now you're into the heavy duty each day hop selection. Brewers come to town back and forth and dinners and get together and so forth. And then from there, after that selection period of time, you're flying off to the Great American Beer Fest. So that's the 23rd of September. And 24th, you're having the Brewers dinner at the Wind Coop and the Falling Rocks and so forth. 27th, OBF. And then after that, we had our Rocktoberfest, where we got together and had at the Rock Bottom, had the big party with Reese and ourselves. And then we had the Alpha King Challenge on the 26th down at the Falling Rock. And that particular year was the Deuce Imperial IPA, and that was Gino Acevedo from El Toro Brewing Company. So that was, the Alpha King going on. Then you're flying home, and then more selections at the end of September. And then you're turning around on the 4th, you're flying of October, you turn right around, you're flying back to Milwaukee for the National Master Brewers Association meeting. And so you're having the big Breeze party going on. Basically, on the 7th, you've got the Master Brewers in Lakefront and Water Street. And then after the event's over, I'm going down to Chicago, driving in through there. And on the 9th, going over into Kalamazoo and Battle Creek and up to New Holland, and then back down from New Holland, driving all the way back up to probably Kenosha, was near Milwaukee, and then flying back home and getting home. And then on the 11th, and turn right around the next week, on the 17th and 18th, going to the Master Brewers Association's Northwest meeting in Seattle, getting home on the 19th, and then on the 25th of October, driving to Seattle again for that Washington Brewers Guild Cask Festival. And then the 26th, driving home. And then the November, was going to get things organized and back together. And that's when you go down to the 19th Oregon Brewers Guild meeting in Portland on the 20th and drive home. And so then December 2003, home safe. And you're like, whoa, man, that was a run and a half. So just want to let you know that that's where you, by keeping track of that and having that calendar and writing that down and knowing that you're following up and keeping all of that, and it allows you to create some history on it. And also by sharing that, it can get a person anybody now that's in sales and traveling and going back across the country, and know that that's what you have to do to keep it going. And that's part of the world we live in. And at this point in time, being, now older point, years from that, back at 51, that was a few, 51 years old, 60 8 now. So in some respects, also because I'm not traveling all the time and not drinking and eating and all that stuff, I ended up losing about 50 pounds. So that's a case where there's some positives to it as well. But part of that whole concept was just to be able to, be able to share a little bit of that fun with you. I had a couple of other ones, basically going into some more little insight here. I wanted to share a little bit more fun with you, and that would relate to, this one can be a little bit hard to read, but this was basically an old beer that was produced by Snoqualmie Falls, and they basically had, it was called Ralph Squared, Ralph Olson, Ralph Woodall, and here we are up on Mount Rushmore, Ralph, and then Ralph Jr., and there we are on each side of a hop cone there for Ralph Jr. And so that was one that Snoqualmie Falls had brewed up, and as it turns out, particularly on that particular batch, they did have some pain, and it did not make it through into a heavy scale marketing program, but wanted to do a little reading just to give you some historical perspective, and with Randy Reed and Snoqualmie Falls and so forth. And basically this one was called Ralph Squared. Meet Ralph Squared, a very special ale, which has much character as the individual who inspired it. Ralph Olson and Ralph Woodall of Hop Union CBS, the Northwest premier hop suppliers in the craft brewing industry. The recipe for Ralph was designed working backwards from Ralph Olson's personal hop variety selection, around which I designed the rest of the beer. So this collaborative process, the three of Ralph's favorite hops are front and center in this, our biggest, hoppiest offering to date. All of us at Snoqualmie Falls hope you enjoyed drinking this as much as we did creating it. Randy Reed, head brewer. And then choosing the hops that were used for the beer was fun, but by any means, not an easy task. I recommend 3 varieties because of the uniqueness of the horizon in the new Northwest high alpha and bittering hop that have been getting a good reception from the brewing industry. Santiam is a relatively new aroma hop developed in the U.S. that has many old world and noble characteristics. Saaz is very old classic European traditional hop that has been used for many years by brewers around the world. Our most gracious regards to Snoqualmie Falls Brewing Company for honoring us with beer that bears our names, and that's from Ralph L. Olson Jr. and Ralph L. Woodall Jr. from Hop Union CBS. And so that was the Ralph Squared, Ralph 2. So then going into the Ralph Jr., I'm going to read that one for you too, because it's kind of fun just to share some of that with you. And Ralph Jr. is a small beer produced from the weaker Ralph Squared, our 2001 annual special release honoring Ralph Olson and Ralph Woodall, the 2 Ralphs of Hop Union. Using time-honored techniques, after collecting only the highly concentrated first runnings from the mash done from Ralph Squared, we collected more wort from the same mash and created a flavorful small beer. It's much of the same characteristics as its progenitor. A small beer goes, this one turns out to be substantially enough on its own right to earn the title Ralph Jr. The hop used in Ralph Jr. are the same 3 varieties Ralph Olson of Hop Union selected for Ralph Squared. As it turns out, both Ralphs are in fact juniors themselves, their representative fathers being named Ralph as well. This brew is doubly fitting. As most Northwest craft brewers will attest, it's primarily through the dedicated effort of the 2 Ralph Juniors that we enjoy the veritable smorgasbord of hop varieties available to us today. So raise your glass and toast fathers and sons the world around. So that's kind of a fun little read on for that one. So that's just, again, Randy goes way back in our days, and I haven't seen Randy for quite a while. I haven't been doing any road trips and so forth, but just wanted to be able to share that one with you. And another fun one I wanted to just share, because we still got some time, but I basically got my old road warrior road trip case, traveling along, and have that all through there. And it's probably about 20 different tags on the top of here. You know, this would be, I would be running through the airport and have all my details and be in here, all the notes and backup papers and so forth, and kept that for all those years. So it's kind of a fun one to be able to share, to let you know that there's a lot of history and a lot of time went into that particular event. And so events going back and forth. And then wanted to also go into a little bit more here for some of the different things that were going on as each of these events were taking place. You would be able to get your brochures and see what was going on. So here, this is a particular one. Here's the Great Taste at the Beer Festival, Great American Beer Festival. Okay, basically September 2001. So you go back in time on that, and you can go back. Basically that's the 20th celebration at that point in time, going into all of the different, basically going back into the days, and Charlie being in there, and then just all of the different things happening. But that's where Elliot lists every one of the breweries that was involved in there. Same thing as today. Got Hopkin and be a nice big ad in there for that time, showing what we're at, and then going into the listings of where our booths would be set up, and then beers, festivals, and just going on from there, different things going on. So that's where you have these historical pieces, and it gives you a chance to be able to go back in time and see what was going on, see the breweries, see the styles of beers that were winning. You have that dealing with there. Also, here's the Mountain Brew Fest. This is from 2006, but that's basically going back into over into Idaho Falls. And again, going into Idaho, reading some of the local color and some of the different characteristics, and some of the different things you can do around that area, and then dealing with the location where it was going to be at. So those are things that you want to keep in mind whenever you're out traveling, that it's fun to get that and keep it, but also to read through them, get an insight of what's going on, and to be able to know that there's a lot of information that can give you insight into the beer world if you're getting into it, and also historical perspective if you've been around. It kind of helps enhance some of the past that's been going on there. Then for just to let you know too, I did a fun little breakdown here. This is the Ralph Squared and Ralph Jr. What that related to was taking the business cards, putting them together in the copy there, and that's got the Ralph Olson, general manager and owner, Hopkins and craft brewing specialist, and then Ralph Woodall, director of craft brewing sales from the old Hopkins days. That's back in time now, so we're working our way through it. And then get into a couple more things. Wanted to just follow up with you from a historical perspectives regarding some of the old magazines. And used to be, when you're in traveling all the time, you're in the focus and people know what's going on, and so the next thing you know, you're being communicated with. So this basically is Imbibe magazine. This issue is from June of 2008, and that's during that hop crisis period of time. And so they had an interview with me. They actually came up and did some visits and talking, and ended up having a couple of the reporters came through Yakima to interview me. We're up on top of the country club drive lookout over the Moxie Valley. And then from there, they did the interview with me and came back in. So as it turns out, we're involved there. Next thing you know, the Imbibe magazine, of course, lots of brewing information, different styles of beers and so forth. Then if you flip back in to the back part, then you've got Trouble Brewing. And so that's me sitting there with, of course, the hop unit in the hop field down off of Birchfield Road, and that's pretty close over to Loftus and ranches and so forth. And on that particular one, it's got hop unions Ralph Woodall, Trouble Brewing. Hop shortages may be causing panic among some craft brewers, but what does it mean for your next pint? And it gives us some sense of what's going on here. That story by Adam Templeton and photography by Aaron Brazil. So there was there. So this basically kind of a real quick little read. Hailstorms in the Czech Republic, tornado in Slovenia, flooding in England. There's something almost biblical about the three of the major factors that have put the world's hop supply at a critical shortage. In a matter of weeks, the 2007 European hop crop was virtually decimated by inclement weather. Closer to home in Washington State, Yakima Valley, which grows 70% of the U.S. hop supply, a fungus outbreak resulted in a subpar crop. And so then it goes in and talks about, the different issues going on, what was happening at that period of time, talking to some of the different breweries and so forth. And they had a little interview in there with me. And so that's where you end up knowing that you're part of the world and that you want to be a part of the communications, what's going on, and they're talking in here. I was able, what was available, the 2.7 U.S. crop was quickly snatched up by European brewers. The biggest factor that hit us more than anything was the amount of U.S. hops being sold to breweries outside the U.S. at harvest time, says Ralph Woodall, sales director of Hop Union, a broker that buys hops from Northwest farmers and sells them to craft breweries and brew pubs across North America. There where the whole dynamics were changing real fast. It was hard to compete against the euro at that point in time. We had the euro happening. Basically, it became very apparent very quickly that the big trouble was brewing for the craft beer world. Even though the craft beer business, small percentage beer sold in the U.S., Woodall says it affects us a lot more when all of a sudden somebody's buying hops that we might have had access to. That put a cramp in our style real fast. But anyway, just to know that those were periods of time, but then to be, basically in there, having that one going. And then also you're dealing now, again, this is All About Beer magazine. So you got the All About Beer, and this is of January of 11. And on that particular one, they have inside here, it says, meet the educators, major ingredients of great beer knowledge. And so that's a picture of me out in front of the hop field, basically back in those times, wearing the tie-dye shirt and so forth. And that would have been from Hop and Brew School tour. So that's what you're missing out on this year. But at the same time, this also is give you some insight into the hop world itself. So going back into here, meet the educators, and they have some different characters here. Got Chris White from White Labs, and then the Pursuit of Hoppiness. And I'm just going to take a quick minute to read this. The Pursuit of Hoppiness. Ralph Woodall first became acquainted with hops as a teenager when he worked fall harvest seasonal jobs. 40 years later, of course, that's 10 years ago, he's still finding new things to talk about when it comes to the conical flower. You get hops in your blood, Woodall says. You develop a passion for hops that kind of gets ingrained into you over the years. Woodall, 57 at that time, so that's over 10 years ago, took a job with the Hop Union in 83. And this Western Hop Company changed hands 5 times over the years along the way. Woodall's watched the birth of the craft community in the United States. Back then, the craft microbrewery was just starting. We were mainly dealing with Anheuser-Busch Coors, Stroh's, Miller's, Pabst, Olympia, Rainier in the beginning. Woodall says it was almost like a hobby when we started dealing with Sierra Nevadas, Bridgeports, Red Oaks, Pyramids in the mid-'80s. Then the craft brewing business exploded, he says. We had an inside track on working with craft brewers, knowing the hops they were used and dealing with smaller quantities, Woodall said. By the mid-'90s, craft brewers had become the major share of the hop union business in the U.S. Woodall worked as traffic manager in the early days, growing to the position of director of operations. And then he could see the explosion happening in the craft beer segment and the daily shipments waiting for the UPS pickups. We'd have 4 or 5 44-pound boxes going out. When it got to be 20 boxes a day, I used to jump in and help get the shipments out, Woodall says. Then it got to be 40 boxes a day. And that's when I started to getting to the pallets shipments, and I said, I'm done. Woodall became director of craft brewing sales in 97, traveling around the country, meeting stores and brewers. I was a true road warrior salesperson. We visited breweries and attended festivals and conventions. I would end up visiting 300 plus brewers a year, Woodall says. In the early days, he would be on the road, run across a startup in the middle of a trip that no one knew about. It's interesting to see a guy like Bert Grant, Widmer Brothers, to shoot startup stages. Now these breweries have all been around for 20 plus years. Woodall looks back at the hop varieties like Centennials and Columbus, Chinooks, of course, Amarillos, Simcoes, and now the Citrus, and trace their specific success to pioneering breweries and creative beer recipes that they use, and that's working together with them. Things really changed when hoppier beer started coming into play. There was a real evolution in beer styles and new appreciation for hops among brewers and consumers. Woodall believes that companies like Hop Union breweries that led the way the formulation of today's craft beer movement have a responsibility to mentor new people coming into the industry and help them recognize how we got here. Woodall notes that the change in the hop market during the couple of decades has not been without challenges. The most notable was the hop shortage took place in 07. He said the crisis made it clear and involved that there need to be a balance between farmers, dealers, and brewers in trading and agricultural commodities. Things were out of balance, and it took about 3 years the crisis developed. There was a reduction of acres devoted to hops in the early 2000s. At the same time, more craft brewers were coming online. By 2007, we had a hop shortage. The economic downturn of 2008 signaled the end of the increased hop demand. However, as prices have gone down, growers again reduced the amount of hops that they had been planted. At the same time, beer sales were rebounding. It's difficult to past 3 years, now we're seeing sustainable pricing to growers, Woodall said. According to Woodall, the 2010 crop came back from a cold, wet spring that delayed the growing season. A hot summer meant an average yield, but overall acreage has been reduced by as much as 20% in key U.S. growing regions. the result is that there may be some spot shortages of certain varieties, which will be further exacerbated by demand from hop-forward beers like Indian Pale Ales. The harvest of import hops is mixed due to the weather conditions in August, but surplus hops from the 2009 harvest will help fill the gaps. Hops have a way of coming through, Woodall says. So, but anyway, that just gives you a fun little recap on that one. And so we're going down to one more quick one here, you guys, and I'll wrap up here in a minute. So we're dealing here with All About Beer, Celebrated Beer News, and this is from July of 12. And that's when they have basically nooks and crannies, finding the perfect beer in the most unexpected places. And this particular one has a fun shot in here. I'm just taking a minute here. That's me up on top of Darwin Mountain Lookout, looking out over Mount Adams, and back in those days. And so there's a little quick read in here for you. And according to Ralph Woodall, the director of sales of Hopkins in Yakima, Washington, nature is often the best place to enjoy craft beer. In 1983, I was on top of Darwin Mountain in central Washington state, about an hour Jeep ride west on the top of the Cascade Range. Woodall says from the Darwin Mountain Lookout, you can see south to Mount Bachelor, Mount Hood in Oregon, into Washington State, Mount Adams, and Mount St. Helens, with the view in wide span encompassing the Goat Rocks, Mount Rainier, and then north, Old Snowy, Mount Stewart, and east to the Yakima Valley. He was with Sierra Nevada Brewing, Ken Grossman and Steve Dressler, and then Hop Union colleague Ralph Olson. The beers were Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, Porters, Stouts, and Bigfoot. Seriously, this is the best place and way to do it. Get the beer you like, the hill you can climb, and the scene that makes you shine, and you have all that is divine. I have been back many times in the past 30 years, and it always brings a chill to my spine. The memory of time. It can be Pike Peak, Mount Shasta, Mount Katahdin, the Smoky Mountains, or even top of Canyon de Chelly. So that's where that fun comes in, and being able to be known well enough to be able to communicate with somebody, contact you and find out your story. And that's a case where Darwin Mountain Lookout, man, that's where you'd want to go, get up there and get away from it all, and then chill, and then come back down for the next day. So, but anyway, I've been rambling on here quite a bit, but just wanted to let you know part of this world is sharing the world and having some fun, and that I've got so much details and information, it's hard for me to get it all together at any one moment in time, and but you have to talk fast, and hopefully it's been a case where you've been able to kind of ingrain what's going on. So we're making it happen and keeping it together. So again, if you have any particular questions or feedback, or even with follow-up of what I was doing then and some of the events, and if you happen to be in part of those events, then it'd be kind of nice to hear from you guys. But in the meantime, I wanted to just follow up next week and see what's going on, and I'll think of another round and track down where we can go from there. So wanted to follow up with you guys. So we've got still tough times here in the Valley. And again, it's tough now with the virtuals for people not being able to come in, but that's the nature of this particular year. So we'll want to share this with you, because if you were here now, I'd be basically giving you some history, walking around, showing you different things, talking some of the back days, and following up with people. And this gives me an opportunity to download a little bit of that out and share it with everybody, get that going, and then working it together and keeping it together. So wanted to say take care, have a good one, and hops to all, and good day, and keep it going. Don't give up and keep on trying. Okay.